And Tony's going to talk to us about reason, emotion and morality, some cautions for the Enhancement project.
Good, thank you, Dan. Is that coming out okay? I don't need to adjust that, no. Well, I'm just going to basically read this. I've got a slight display. This isn't really a proper PowerPoint thing. I apologise in advance, but there's just some help in it. It's a standard approach in both popular speech and academic contexts alike to admonish someone as being emotional or using emotive speech. There's an implied and often explicit contrast with the speaker's own reliance upon reason or rationality. The speaker is cool and collected, where you, the accused, are heated. The contrast and its evaluative emphasis has struck me in examining the human enhancement debate, since it's sometimes claimed that one of the divergences between so-called liberal proponents of human enhancement and the conservative proponents of the project is that the conservatives, or at least that group of them whose objections are roughly speaking inherent rather than prudential, rely upon emotion, whereas their opponents rely upon reason. This claim, often explicitly or implicitly, takes it that the two human faculties of emotion and reason are strongly opposed, and that the appeal to emotion is somehow illicit. The role of emotion is often equated with gut feeling and disparaged as at best a kind of shorthand reaction produced by some evolutionary processes to allow quick responses when reason hasn't time to do the real work. This is common in the writings of neuroscientists who address themselves to ethics, and is most prominent in the work of Joshua Green and his colleagues. It's then taken up by philosophers who want to object to conservative views in a range of areas, and notably in the enhancement debate. What I want to do here is discuss the relation between emotion and reason, thereby summarising and joining a debate amongst philosophers that's had too little impact upon the neuroscientists and their philosophical admirers. I argue that the common derogatory opposition is oversimplified and dubiously helpful. I hope this will contribute to an understanding of the nature of reasons and reasoning, since a person's success in seeking truth is as much guided by the positive aspects of their emotional makeup as by the positive aspects of what we think of as their intellective life. Sketching the tradition. The tradition in Western thought and elsewhere too, to the effect that reason and emotion are two distinct and even warring elements in our conscious makeup, is ancient and persistent. Reason is pictured as pure, cool, higher, authoritative and ideally regulative, whereas emotion is seen as tainted, turbulent, lower and in need of control. Some of this opposition arises from philosophical traditions, some of it religious traditions. On the philosophical side, one might cite Plato's image in the Phaedrus of the charioteer of reason, ruling the two galloping horses of the passions. Admittedly, Plato has one of the horses, the white one interestingly enough, represent good emotions, even though they must still be under the control of emotionless reason. Nor is this image irrelevant to Plato's developed theory of moral fulfilment as rational contemplation of the eternal bloodless form of the good, nor is his picture of healthy civil society as the domination of unruly, passionate plebs by the philosophically rational guardians. Certain aspects of Stoic thought also contribute to the picture, since they describe most of what we would call emotions, plus some other affective states as involving inherently false judgments that must be corrected by reason. The Stoics did somewhat grudgingly recognise that there were a few good feelings, as they call them, but their description of these is decidedly cool, dispassionate and remote from human experience. For Diogenes, condemnation of pleasure, fear and desire are supposedly mitigated by an endorsement of joy as a well-reasoned elation, or watchfulness or caution as well-reasoned shrinking, and wishing as a well-reasoned wishing. On the religious side, the strand of Christianity that opposes the flesh to the spirit sometimes includes rather a lot of human emotional orientations within the category of the flesh that need to be subdued by the spirit. Paul's letter to the Galatians, with its dictum that the desires of the flesh are against the spirit and the desires of the spirit are against the flesh, has been influential here, as has much else that I'll omit for now. We might, for convenience, but with awareness of the looseness involved, call this reason tradition rationalism, and it's been criticised recently not only for gender bias, as in Genevieve Lloyd's The Man of Reason, but for various failures to recognise the valuable and irreducible role that emotion can play in human reasoning and moral thinking. Martha Nussbaum has stressed the positive and negative importance of emotions for reason, and this is connected with recent advocacy of an ethics of caring as a counterweight to rationalistic ethics. Of course, the history of both philosophy and theology have seen some similar emphases. One notable reaction against an excessive rationalism was that of John Stuart Mill, who records movingly and sometimes painfully in his autobiography the revolution in his outlook brought about by his recognition of the crucial place of emotion in poetry, nature and the arts in a fulfilling human life. As Mill puts it, that's not Mill. That's what I meant to put up at the start of the whole thing. So look at that for a minute, then I'll give you Mill. That's more a couple of items from literature to give the feel of the stress that I'm trying to put forward. Your time's up, almost. I still see some eyes moving. I'm going to run out of time, but I want to. Too late. This is Mill. I'll let you absorb Mill while I rush on. Now, more recently, there have been even further significant moves in philosophy towards a more sympathetic and nuanced picture of the role of emotions in a morally fulfilling life. Typically, this has produced a great deal of focus, distinction-laden and often technical disputation, but the general tendency is clearly more positive than the rationalist tradition sketched above. I want to turn now to the turn to neuroscience, and I don't think I'll put anything more up there. I did have some stuff about the difference between deontology and utilitarianism, which figures in some of this stuff, but I think I'll put that up later if there are some people here who are fortunately innocent of this phenomenon. A new development beyond philosophy has cast a different sort of light on the reason-emotion divide. This is the development within the discipline of cognitive science or neuroscience of an account of the brain's functions that shows or purports to show various things about the relations of emotion and reason in thinking, and especially in moral thinking and deciding. A significant moment in this development was Antonio Damasio's book Descartes' Error, Emotion, Reason and the Human Brain, which began in the introduction by stating, "I had been advised early in life that sound decisions come from a cool head, that emotions and reasons did not mix any more than oil and water. I had grown up accustomed to thinking that the mechanisms of reason existed in a separate province of the mind, where emotion should not be allowed to intrude, and when I thought of the brain behind that mind, I envisioned separate neural systems for reason and emotion." But this picture was destroyed for Damasio when he studied the history of Phineas P.Gage, whose life had been transformed in 1848 by a horrible accident when an explosion drove an iron rod 43 inches long and 1¼ inches thick weighing over 13 pounds, straight through his brain and out again, landing a good 100 feet away, covered in blood and brains. Contrary to every expectation, Gage was not killed. Indeed, shortly after the accident, he was capable of describing the accident and its aftermath calmly in great detail to a doctor who attended him and found him, quote, perfectly rational, unquote. But Gage's subsequent history showed that although his capacity for logical reasoning was unimpaired, his character and the emotional resources that had made him a highly respected and capable human being were largely destroyed. His reasoning about what to do, how to respond to others and how to shape his life was dramatically impaired. He could not sustain work, became dissolute and unreliable, exhibited himself in a freak circus and died at the age of 38. Damasio and his colleagues managed to find out a surprising amount about the type of damage to Gage's brain and the likely source of the impediments that dogged the rest of his life. Taking hints from that, Damasio conducted numerous contemporary investigations of brain damage that confirmed his dawning conviction that, quote, reason may not be as pure as most of us think it is or wish it were, and that emotions and feelings may not be intruders in the bastion of reason at all. They may be enmeshed in its networks for worse or for better. This is not the place for a full resume of Damasio's empirical studies and conclusions, impressive and stimulating as they are. I cite his work merely to illustrate an interesting shift in the traditional separation of reason and emotion that I began by outlining. This shift has come from empirical investigation into behaviour and its connection with brain activity, and indeed many subsequent studies have endorsed Damasio's conclusions. But in recent years there's been an upsurge in neuroscientific studies that rely upon fMRI imaging and purport to show that changes in discrete areas of the brain, said to be concerned respectively with emotion and reason, cognition, influence our thinking and deciding about moral and practical matters. This represents a return to some extent to the rationalist tradition described earlier, since the decisions arising from the reason zone are taken to be clearly superior to the mistaken responses arising from the emotion zone. I think that most of these studies have failed to learn properly from Damasio and rely upon a picture of separate and conflicting brain areas for emotion and cognition that merely mirrors the philosophical tradition outlined earlier. There is thus good reason to challenge the model of neuroscience at work here on its own grounds, but I won't make that central here. Some of this work's been done by other people. Many of these studies proceed by showing the strong influence that emotions allegedly have on reactions to descriptions of challenging moral scenarios, often fantasy ones invented by philosophers. And then they contrast these with rational reactions. Quite often the assumption is that the rational and morally right reaction is a utilitarian one. Indeed, as I propose to show, a somewhat narrow version of utilitarian thinking. Barton and Rittos, for example, state that, quote, decisions made on the basis of deontological or non-utilitarian principles usually lead to results that are not as good as the best that could be achieved. It's clear from the context that this is not merely a restatement of the difference between deontological and utilitarian theories, but an often unargued preference for the latter. Other theorists, such as Joshua Green and his colleagues, declare outright that all non-utilitarian judgments in moral matters are simply errors caused by emotional reactions emanating in a specific emotion centre in the brain. Sometimes this line of thought is linked to a somewhat confusing contrast of the personal and impersonal in ways that I can't discuss fully or at all here. I have a section talking about Kuhneman and Tversky and their connection with this story, but I'll leave that out. One recent study, however, by Bartels and Pizarro counters this trend simply by pointing out this utilitarian trend, simply by pointing out its prevalence and question-begging nature, and then by seeking to show that psychopathic personalities, who are commonly regarded as largely lacking a concern for morality and as being defective in certain emotional capacities such as empathy, are conspicuously more comfortable with utilitarian reasoning than with deontological. Since it's also commonly held that psychopaths have plenty of rationality in the rationalistic sense, and since it seems to many theorists and non-theorists that morality is an activity much concerned with good and bad reasons for acting, then the fact that psychopaths are bad exemplars of moral agents means that the rationalist approach, and perhaps utilitarianism more generally, is not a good one for understanding morality, or what is small r rational about it in the way of reason giving. So Bartels and Pizarro. Their study arrives at its conclusions by testing subjects against a scale for psychopathy and then testing them for answers to a battery of moral dilemmas, mostly drawn or adapted from philosophers' examples. It also checked the responses against scales for what it calls Machiavellianism and no meaning to life attitudes, and these also showed greater tendency to support what they call the utilitarian solutions to the dilemmas. Gratifying as these conclusions are to those of us who are neither psychopaths nor utilitarians, there are reasons, unfortunately, to be sceptical about the ambitious extent of the conclusions of this experiment, even if it's not as crude conceptually as the studies it criticises. I shall leave aside for the moment problems about the nature of psychopathy, on which there is considerable debate within psychiatry and psychology, and mention several other conceptual crudities in the analysis which Bartels and Pizarro have inherited from those they disagree with. First, there is the understanding of utilitarianism, which is construed in narrow act utilitarian terms, without any appreciation of the more complex versions of the theory, such as rule or other indirect forms of utilitarianism. Nor is there any attempt to explore or mention a distinction between utilitarianism as a theoretical justification for morality, by contrast with a decision procedure for particular actions. To be fair, many of the studies these people criticise do equate moral rationality with primitive act utilitarianism. This simplification is important because more complex utilitarian theories might well yield the same result as the deontological or non-utilitarian reaction as the theorists categorise it. Stephen Nathanson, for instance, has argued for an absolute moral rejection of terrorist acts on rule utilitarian grounds, even though it's usually thought that utilitarians dismiss all absolute moral prohibitions and therefore allow that some terrorist acts, say in ticking bomb situations, may be morally right. Second, there is no appreciation of the fact that some of the moral puzzles provided are such that many non-utilitarian theorists would give the very same answers that the so-called utilitarians give. This is a feature not only of Bartels Pizarro, but of all the neuroscience studies of the so-called moral dilemmas that I've seen. One of the Bartels Pizarro dilemmas is taken without attribution straight from Bernard Williams' Jim and the Indian story. I've got a thing to show the Jim and the Indian story for those who don't know it. I'll put that up later on because I'm going to push on. This is about Jim being given the opportunity in a South American jungle by a notorious police chief who's got 10 captive Indians to shoot one of them, and thereby the other 9 will go free, and if he doesn't do that, the police chief will shoot all 10. And Williams, though a fierce opponent of utilitarianism, gives the same answer to the problem as those the study treats as utilitarians. Williams says it would be the right thing for Jim to do, even though he's not a utilitarian, and he grounds that on non-utilitarian consideration. Like Michael Walz's famous category of dirty hands in politics, this suggests that psychologists studying moral thinking often fall into the vulgar error of mistakenly construing any concern for consequences in morality as utilitarian, whereas deontologists and other non-utilitarians are certainly free to consider consequences in a range of cases. Even in the moral dilemma examples, some deontologists would allow, as we saw with Williams, that the so-called utilitarian response is morally acceptable, and dirty hands theorists would allow that extreme emergency situations sometimes permit very great negative consequences to count in a certain way against normally deeply moral, even absolute constraints. Similar things can be said of the soldier's example. That's one of leaving an injured soldier to be captured and killed when saving him would mean that all of the troop, including him, would be killed. And the bystander driver example, which is part of trolleyology, as they call it. This is the famous trolley example, which again I've got something I can show on the screen later. The driver example, which is where someone driving a trolley comes to a fork in the road and the rails, and if it can't stop the trolley, and there's one person tied to the left-hand rail and 5 to the right-hand rail, should he exercise his power to turn the thing one way or the other, and the supposed utilitarian solution is that he turns it to the left to kill the one in order to save the other 5. But on that example, non-utilitarians like Frances Cam, who's a fierce non-utilitarian, she agrees to turn to the left. She gives deontological reasons for supporting the supposedly utilitarian solution, and gives extremely complex deontological reasons for rejecting the utilitarian response in another version of the case called the footbridge example, where the thing is going along a single rail, but there are 5 people going to be run over, and you're on a bridge looking down, and you think, my gosh, and along comes an obliging stranger, and you grab him and toss him over, and that stops the thing. And the utilitarian solution is supposed to be, yes, you do, and the deontological, no, you don't. Cam says, no, you don't for that one, though she doesn't for the other one. It's hard to see Cam's extremely complex reasons for this as the result of an erroneous reliance on emotion. Certainly, if you know Frances, you wouldn't think it was that. Whatever her brain states are doing. Similar points can be made about deontological theorists who discuss difficult cases, short of dirty hands, who judge permissibly when there are small numbers of deaths caused to save a much larger number of lives, but impermissibly when a large number of lives are to be sacrificed for an even larger number saved. Now here I'm not defending such deontological theories and theorists, but merely pointing out the complexities that are consistently ignored or just not understood by the neuroscientists. A further point is that utilitarians, unlike most non-utilitarians, have no room for a ground floor distinction between the permissible and the obligatory, so responses to what is permissible or non-permissible, which most of the experiments call for, they say, can you do this, can you do that, is it permissible? Inevitably leave it open whether the permissible response is a sloppy shorthand for obligatory or carries a non-utilitarian message. One might also note that the loose vocabulary of moral dilemma used by all the psychological studies of moral decision-making obscures the issues in another way, namely that philosophers tend to use the term to denote those situations in which there is no right or wrong answer to the decision problem that the agent faces. In the examples considered by Bartels and Pizarro, different agents give different answers to the puzzling cases, but each thinks that their answer is unequivocally right without moral remainder. Or if they don't actually think that, the experimental scenario forces them to act as if they do. For dirty hands theorists, the story they tell, whether coherent or not, is that the action is morally wrong, but nonetheless the right thing to do. For moral dilemma theorists, either choice of actions is neither right nor wrong. Morality drops out at that point. It may be thought this qualm is too technical to insist upon, but I think the point's worth making because it not only highlights the apparent philosophical ignorance of many neuroscientists, but also because it shows the extreme artificiality of the demand for a binary response, yes, no, permitted, not permitted, in the use of the dilemma examples. Joshua Green, for instance, who has a philosophy background and should not be ignorant of such complexities, cheerfully treats various extreme philosophers' examples, broadly characterised as trolleyology, as being moral dilemmas that reveal the structure of moral cognition. They are, he says, moral illusions, revealing for the manner in which they mislead us. That's a quote from him. The misleading is invariably done by what he calls a moral gizmo in the brain that produces emotional reactions as alarm bells that warn us off various acts such as pushing an innocent bystander under a trolley. Although Green's ruling picture of such gizmos is of moral illusions, comparable to such visual illusions as the Muller lines, that must be subjected to the corrective power of utilitarian rationality, he occasionally admits that they can do some good and maintains only that they are not infinitely wise. But then neither is cool reason, nor any other faculty or brain function, as such brutal paragons of unemotional, cool rationality as Victor Hugo's dedicated policeman Javert in Les Miserables forcefully illustrate. Defects in the laboratory study of our moral brains extend beyond the considerations I've adduced so far to the likely irrelevance of such studies to the realities of moral thinking and emotion in the world where they actually matter. Not only are the binary responses inadequate reflections of the philosophical theories they purport to reflect, but as philosophers such as Appia, Burker and Glannon have recently pointed out, the scenarios considered in laboratory conditions are very unlikely to elicit the thinking and feeling that actual real-life encounters with difficult moral decisions will involve. Being asked to imagine how you would respond and why to a described emergency scenario is not the same as being in that scenario, and it's a big assumption to think that A, the reasoning and feeling that occurs in the former will be the same as that in the latter, and B, that the brain states involved in both will be the same. There are many reasons to doubt any such identities. One is that the real-life scenario will probably differ in myriad detail from its imagined twin, thus giving rise to options deliberately excluded from the twin. Another is that my engagement with the real case confronts me with actual people and circumstances and not descriptions or even visual presentations in a laboratory. There's little reason to think my responses and guesses about the latter will match my responses and thought about the former. It does, however, further highlight the lack of philosophical sophistication and depth involved in the way many neuroscientists often resort to philosophical examples and theories. Returning to Bartels and Pizarro, I think that in spite of some of their work involving some of the confusions discussed above, a number of their points survive. No doubt they have drawn upon philosophical positions crudely and inaccurately and been ignorant of much of the complexity in philosophical debates, but at least they've shown that a narrow version of utilitarianism or consequentialism that is at least a widespread tendency of thought, influential upon many in the wider community, as well as intellectuals, should not be uncritically assumed by experimenters properly to characterise genuine moral thinking and deciding. Moreover, their experiments, though sharing some of the problematic difficulty complained of, do strongly suggest that the casting of all emotions involved in moral thinking and deciding as error-inducing, by contrast with a certain model of rationality, is ill-considered. The authors also are clear that they do not mean to imply that all people who have thought their way through to an endorsement of utilitarianism as a philosophical theory of morality are thereby exhibiting or prone to psychopathy. Furthermore, when their research is purged of misleading assumptions, it suggests ways that the concentration on an emotionally detached model of reason may itself produce errors, since it can obscure or even omit altogether the possibly benign role of emotion in thinking and reasoning about moral questions, and thereby fail to acknowledge the dangers adherence to that model poses for a fulfilling life. I want to turn now to the nature of emotions, and I may not be able to get through all of this. Some philosophers in the revival of interest in emotions have treated them as heavily cognitive, virtually equating them to beliefs. The cognitivists, as they're called, following Bob Solomon being one. Here they have recognised that emotions are not raw upsurges, but have a reason-oriented structure in several ways. They have, however, failed to give sufficient weight to the usual feeling element in emotion and its common connection with bodily sensations, as in the heat that can go with anger or the trembling with fear, and they have assimilated the world-directedness of emotion too closely to belief, where it seems, I think, more akin to perception. They were right to see that not just any subjective upsurge can count as fear or anger or compassion, since these emotions must have a characteristic rational structure, So fear must typically be governed by the thought of an object under the aspect of being dangerous to the perceiver or agent. There are no doubt nameless fears or a general fear of the world, but at core, fear is governed by a fairly specific thought that concerns danger to the agent and those she's closely identified with. Where the thought of danger is totally misplaced, it's right to call it irrational, even though in terms of its associated feelings and bodily effects, it is still a sort of fear. Similarly, anger is typically geared towards slights or injuries related to the agent's concerns or well-being. It makes no sense to describe someone as angry or being well treated at the successes of a close friend unless the agent thinks the good treatment is a bit of condescension towards her, or that the friend's successes have somehow been achieved at some resented cost to the agent herself. Again, gratitude cannot coherently be felt at something that can in no way be understood as a gift. It's no accident or mere social prejudice that nameless fear or objectless anger are pathological. The latter point's important because this directedness of emotions, or their intentionality, is more akin to that of perception, so that, as with perception, it's possible for an emotion to represent a state of affairs that the agent believes does not obtain. So just as an agent can see an object as elliptical, but correctly believe it's round, so she can be afraid of a spider, thus emotionally representing it as dangerous when she may believe on good evidence that it's harmless. But quite apart from the agent's thought or judgment about an object or the way it appears in emotion to him, there remains the question whether the emotion really fits its object. The person who is afraid of something that is not really fearful or dangerous, as someone who is afraid of a realistic toy spider, has been led astray by the emotion, just as someone who misperceives in dim light their own reflection in a mirror for another person has been led astray by their senses. Similarly, someone who's indignant about a wrong that isn't really a wrong has an emotion that fails to match its object, even if the emotion is triggered by a relevant thought, namely that of a wrong. There is even a sense in which people can still be led astray by their fear or indignation, even when they know the spider is a toy or the supposed affront not a wrong. Emotions are also related to the way the world is in a forward-looking fashion, in that they prompt a typical range of object-related reactions, such as flight from the danger feared, or more positive ways of eliminating it. Admiration prompts emulation, indignation prompts attempts to remedy the wrong, and jealousy prompts the sort of actions that lead to Othello's disastrous decline. A further thing about emotions that invokes a cognitive or intellectual dimension is the way that they can be discordant or harmonious with each other and with the agent's quest for a fulfilling life. One doesn't have to have a rigid conception of what such a life must be like, but there are limits to what it can be. Emotions like envy, jealousy, spitefulness, and with some qualifications hatred, carry with them disturbances of emotional balance that interfere with such emotional dispositions as kindliness, love, admiration, and gratitude. Any attempt to live a good life must at least involve a modicum of attention to having good reasons for what we do and how we plan our lives. If we gear rationality to living rather than as well as theorising, we must pay particular attention to the rational dimensions of emotion and not view emotions as mere raw, distorting turbulences. Indeed, there's good reason to think of trusting our emotions in the same sort of way that we trust our other resources for dealing with the world we live in. What we usually consider our strictly cognitive resources for recognising and exploring the world, for example, sensory perception, memory, introspection, inferential capacities and testimony, can all lead us astray, as can our emotions. But we need to have a general trust in those cognitive resources, not only to survive, but to have any prospect of living well. Epistemologists have increasingly realised that attempts to somehow prove the reliability of such cognitive resources without circularity are doomed to failure. This is, of course, a crucial move in sceptical arguments, but assuming that scepticism has little to tell us about how to live, and here I sidestep certain ways in which ancient sceptics did indeed think they provided a lesson for living, what the circularity problem helps to show is that there is a certain trust in our cognitive faculties that is central to coping with ourselves and the environment, whatever the ontological status that environment ultimately has. I would argue, as I do in the full version of this paper, and in agreement with Linda Zagzebski in her book Epistemic Authority, that the same point applies cateris paribus to our emotional capacities. Both capacities are central to a trust in self that we need for intellectual and moral flourishing. The basic question to which trust in emotions is addressed is whether they genuinely fit their objects, but there are other questions about them up for adjudication, such as whether some emotions are oriented to the wrong reactions to their objects. This concerns the issue of what patterns of action and emotion prompts, as I put it earlier. Emotions can be cognitively apt for certain objects, but produce a distorted picture of the place of those objects in the world we inhabit. Consider envy. The appropriate object for envy is very roughly the successes or achievements of another. Except for unusual circumstances, we cannot envy failure in another, nor can we envy a rock, though we might envy a neighbour who has secured a particularly fine-looking stone for a centrepiece of her garden. But of course the success of another person is also the proper object of the emotion of admiration. Comparing the achievements or high qualities of another person with our own is integral to the generation of both envy and admiration. But the reactions of both emotions go in opposite directions. Admiration leads naturally to emulation in some degree, or at least to satisfaction that a fellow human being, colleague, co-national, co-religionist, etc., can achieve so well, and this affords a certain encouragement to oneself. Envy, on the other hand, leads to disparagement of the other's achievements, and often it stimulates thoughts that the other's success or honour is undeserved. When we say to someone, "You're just envious of Smith," we mean to highlight the fact that the emotion of envy has distorted the agent's perception and understanding of the achievements of the envied person. Typically, this is what envy does. It misrepresents aspects of the world to the agent, not of course of the facts of the other's achievements, but of the way they were achieved or of their true significance. If one's disparaging thoughts were actually true, that is, for example, if the person's successes were not due to their personal excellences or relevant hard work, but to toadying or bribery or something similar, then one's reaction should not be envy, but rather a healthy emotion such as indignation or something of that sort. Well, I've hoped to chart some of the pitfalls in the tendency to think of our emotional life as detached from, largely hostile to, or in need of rigorous control by an attenuated reason, and to suggest that too much of the neuropsychological investigation of the role of reason and emotion in ethics attends too little to the subtleties and complexities of both philosophical ethics and psychological reality. There are two lessons for the Enhancement project in this. First is that the findings of those psychological come neurological investigations that often go under the label of neuroscience should be scrutinised carefully and used with caution. The second is that various proposals to enhance either our reasonings or our emotions need to attend to the often intimate connections between reason and emotion, since enhancing what we imagine to be one separate and superior category or subcategory is very likely to have serious implications for the other. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Tony. Now, Tony's a very generous philosopher and he'll want to give very comprehensive answers to your questions. So that we get through enough questions, try to keep them very short. Okay?
Thanks for that, Tony. That was very interesting. I might be one of those people who's missed the complexities that you're talking about in one instance, but could you perhaps say a bit more about how Williams justifies the fact that Jim can shoot the 1 to say 10? Because my understanding of that case was that he says Jim shouldn't do that, or we shouldn't require Jim to shoot them, because that causes him to go against some of his commitments, and that nearly makes him sort of a calculator where these various utilities are plugged in and spaced out.
Well, it must be 30 years since I've read that article, so I don't claim to be able to recall the details of this altogether. But my memory was that Bernard puts forward the sort of integrity-oriented reasons that he has for that thing, but allows that in the end it may be that some of the caveats that he gives on this on the situation may be overridden by the fact that if you're absolutely certain, I mean, for one thing, he raises the question, which is perfectly reasonable in the context, how can you trust this police chief, brutal thug that's given you this option and so on? It mightn't happen at all like that. But supposing that could be overcome, and that it's definite this fellow will kill the whole 10, he does think, as I recall, that in those circumstances it is okay to go ahead and do this. But this is not because of standard utilitarian reason. I mean, one reason that's in the mix is, of course, that the fellow you killed, if you don't act like this, that fellow's going to be killed anyway, which is a significant consideration in cases like the parallel ones, like shooting down the, in the 9/11 situation, shooting down the plane full of people who are going to be killed anyway. You might have an absolute prohibition on killing innocent people, but be confronted by a situation in which they're going to be killed by someone else, admittedly, they're going to be killed anyway, and you, to prevent that happening, you kill all these people there because they're going to kill the people in the Twin Towers. And people use that, people who are strong deontologists committed to absolute prohibition would still use that argument in that case.
Okay. Further questions?
They're all tired. Yeah.
Could you say a bit more about Green, because it seemed to me a bit hard on Joshua Green.
I intended to be.
Yeah, that's fairly harsh.
Yeah.
I mean, Green in the end doesn't even see utilitarianism as true. He just says that there are these different moral views that we have in our societies, and we're going to have to have some meta-moral resolution of all this at the political level, and he advocates utilitarianism as the public morality for political deliberation. Now, I don't necessarily agree with that.
No.
But that's a much more subtle view that he's putting than.
Well, I think he says different things in different places, you know. I mean, but in the Moral Tribes, he does explicitly say what I quoted him as saying about a moral illusion. And it's not an illusion if you take what he calls the utilitarian line. As I say, I don't think it's fair to utilitarianism entirely, but it's understandable that he would think of that as a utilitarian line, just in fact a very incomplete account of what is and isn't a utilitarian position. But if he's saying that taking the other view on this, which is supposed to be deontological, is a moral illusion, he's making a very strong claim about what's rational and what's not, and it's nothing to do with political whatnots of any sort at that stage.
Well, I think his official position would be that utilitarianism is an illusion as well. If you thought that was the...
Well, that sounds like your position.
But it's a political compromise in that sense.
Yes, yeah. Well, I mean, I'm just going by what he says in the various parts where he talks about the experiments. Steve.
This is just a partial defence of social psychology and neuropsychology. So, I mean, oftentimes they do the experiments that you rightly point out. The results are not always the way they interpret them. So with Jim and the Indians, it's not obvious that if you're going to kill the one to save the 10 that you are a consequentialist.
Yeah.
But I mean, social psychologists and neuroscientists are in the business of trying to get results. So what they will say is that we have to operationalise these things in order to get data at all. So they'll oftentimes just sort of recognise that, look, it's really difficult to get good data, and we have to simplify things in order to get anything at all. So, I mean, there is then a further worry whether people who are interpreting this data are doing so with an awareness that's gone on. So I agree with you that there's a worry about sort of how someone downstream, like Green, or someone who's reading that. But the actual experiments, the experimenters are usually aware of this.
Are
usually aware of what they're doing.
Yeah, I don't know about, I mean, Green's not interpreting downstream, he does the experiments himself, he and his team anyway. And when they write up their experiments, it's not very far downstream, this is saying what they've done. They move very quickly from, well, here's an interesting fact, or set of facts, these people say this, those people say this, and so on, and there's so many of them, and these, and there's so many of them. They don't say that. They go on and say, these people are doing a utilitarian response, and these people are doing a deontological one, and these people are getting it wrong because they're not doing or at least wrong if you think rational is a good thing to be, because these are the rational things and those are not.
Well, my experience is when you talk to these experimenters, they'll readily admit these sort of things, and they'll give you the operationalisation
story
to explain.
Well, if the trouble is that if they have to do these dodgy and amazingly truncated things to earn a crust, I feel, well, that's one way to earn a living, but I don't know that it should be taken terribly seriously. I mean, I'm not against all people. I mean, I think some of them that I've read are more careful about what they're doing and saying. though I think there's a powerful tendency, and I'm sure you're right that this is about trying to scale things down to manageability, to draw to deal with highly artificial situations, and then say, well, let's go from these to the real world. You know, I mean, the whole Milgram thing, for instance. I don't want to say that it's of no value, whatever, but there's an amazing series of misinterpretations of it, as of the famous Princeton thing of the people running at Stanford. Sorry, yeah. I mean, they consistently reporting that they don't mention the quite high proportion, given the emergency, who did stop to help the guy. Yeah.
Robin?
I don't know, it's not a very well formed point, but back to this idea, I think it came up earlier in Simon's talk that
I'm a bit deaf, Robbie, you'll have to, and with your Irish accent.
But the idea that you could, via some sort of enhancement techniques in, say, a loving relationship, take away the kind of painful emotions that might come in a loving relationship. Like, so if your partner dies or something like that, you would expect to be devastated. You would expect to feel incredible grief. But certainly it's irrational, or not, well, it could be perfectly rational to regret the emotion of grief, the feeling of grief that you'll have. Could be perfectly rational to regret the devastation that you'll feel. But it would seem to be irrational to regret that your relationship was of the type that it would devastate you and fill you with grief if something like that happened.
Yeah.
So, like, I mean, I was just trying to, thinking of that as an example
Yes.
of this
I
tie
think,
between rationality and emotion.
Yeah, I mean, I think grief is an interesting case because it does seem to me that if I remember I wrote a blog for the Centre people on a proposal for pills that some American scientists had come up with that would enable people to lose painful memories. And one of my objections to this, and they just thought this was obviously a good thing, and it seemed to me that one of my objections to this was precisely about grieving. I mean, it does seem to me that if someone had really lost someone they deeply loved, and they felt this very disturbing emotion of grief, and it was going on, and someone said, "Here's a pill. You won't have those feelings anymore about that departed person." Then the person who took this would be doing something that was A, bad, B, unreasonable. I don't like rational and irrational all that much because I think that's got to be preempted for various things. But I would think a person had a lot of reason in that relationship and its cessation to have these debilitating feelings and emotions and so on. And someone, now of course they can go on too long, they can be too acute, you might be able to sleep. There are various things, I don't want to give a total thing on this, but if someone said, it's just this memory, let's get rid of it, there's something deeply wrong with that. And I think it shows the disparagement of, it's connected with something Simon was saying before about, in the first talk, I think. Yeah.
Kirsten?
Yeah, just following up on this point, this is an interesting connection to one of the earlier papers that discusses the boundaries of when are we actually sort of transforming and being something other than it. And so if the normal would be considered to grieve in this situation, and you were kind of not grieving, well then either your relationship wasn't as good as you thought, or there's something abnormal about you.
Mm.
And the question is, in what sense is the abnormality wrong?
Mm.
I suppose that's really the underlying question. So if, for example, you would have a utilitarian approach, and the grieving stops you from doing the things that would actually be good for moving on, then less grief, or maybe no grief,
Yeah.
would be, the best situation. However, if that's considered like wrong, that's where your disagreement, I suppose, is in terms of.
I would think that if you treated the grief as just some imperfection to be got rid of, so that you could get on with various other things and so on, you'd actually be betraying the relationship that you'd had with the loved person, which might be extended over many, many years and so on, and denying something really important about yourself. Now, those things are not, I wouldn't put those things in terms of some, what the other Russell was saying was infinite value. I don't understand the concept of infinite value. I have no idea really what that means, but I think that it's a powerful consideration. Now, it may be that you've got tremendously important, you know, you're the president of the country that's at war or something, and you can't afford to be debilitated for too long. There might be considerations like that come into play. But I'm just talking about one important consideration coming into play from the nature and structure of that emotion, which itself seems to me to have a rationality about it, connected to those intimate relationships.
Well, infinite value is hard to understand, but finite conference program is not. So thanks very much, Tony.
Thanks everyone for coming, and to our speakers and chairs, and also especially to Alberto and C.A.J, who've done good work in the background to make all this happen.